All right, welcome everyone. It looks like there's about 50% of those that registered. It's me about a group of 40 or so today. My name's Jaquel Hyder. I'm with Doran Companies, and I also sit as the chair of the Emerging Professional Committee for EDAM. So for those of you that aren't as involved with this committee's work, the Emerging Professional Committee is a group of 7 individuals from all different backgrounds that are EDAM members, and we work together as a group to really organize this quarterly series, which is called Building Your Toolbox, to help those that are new to the field, maybe switch from planning to economic development, from development to economic development, or in a different professional field and you're trying to get more exposure to economic development and understand how that can bridge into your current career, or you're just brand new out of college. So it's kind of anyone in those stages of their career where they're not seasoned experts and we're still trying to build your network and build your tools, brush off tools, because if you are in economic development or any related field, we all know every project's different and we learn something and we haven't touched it in a few years and it's great to come back to it. So that's kind of the committee's work. You'll see other emerging professional connections through EDAM is how we connect at the conference, reminders on continuing education opportunities. So if you'd like to get more involved, myself is a great contact. We're all listed, all the committee members are listed on the EDAM website. Jen Brewington is our vice chair. She's also on this call. You know, Jen with the city of Shakopee. Joe Schultz and Lauren Cooper, also committee members, are on this today. So feel free as we go into this presentation from Rebecca, if you want to reach out, ask questions in the chat box. You can drop your contact information if you want to network with others. And then as Rebecca goes through her presentation, there'll be time for questions at the end. So you're welcome to put questions in the chat box, but they might get a little lost. So it's better to kind of ping Rebecca at the end. If we run out of time for questions, I sent out an email with this presentation and her contact info. So you can reach out to Rebecca offline as well, especially if you just don't have time to jump on and ask that question or you're shy. Feel free to turn your screen on and be engaged if you're eating because it's lunch hour. Totally get it, no judgment there either. Rebecca, if you want to try to eat while you present, go for it. It looks like Sam Markman just put her contact information in the chat box. Sam is also on the Emerging Professional Committee. She's a rock star at Anoka County. So let's get started. I want to introduce our awesome speaker. Rebecca is a senior municipal advisor with Ellers. She actually was my mentor when I joined the mentor-mentee program through EDAM a couple years ago. Rebecca is just an awesome individual. I feel honored to have your hour of time today, and her experience. She's been with Ellers since 2000, helping Minnesota cities. So long time, Rebecca. I didn't realize it was that long. And implementation and design of financial solutions for projects. Obviously, if you haven't worked with Ellers, here's some background on Ellers. Ellers is really a consultant that helps cities and counties, understand what tax increment financing solutions are, tax abatement, debt issuance, development analysis, public finance related opportunities to assess projects. And with Rebecca's experience, she's been able to really guide dozens and dozens of communities through not only long-term solutions for projects, but also immediate project needs. She, previous to Ellers, worked for the Department of Employment, Economic Development, DEED, and South Dakota's Governor's Office of Economic Development. Rebecca lives in Eagan with her husband and 2 dogs. Love the dog plug. When she's not working, she enjoys traveling, tending to beehives, and spending time with her family and friends. Rebecca, I did not know the beehive fun fact about you. So thank you, Rebecca, for joining. I'm going to turn it over to you and stop blabbing, and excited to see your presentation.
Well, thank you. That was a very, very kind introduction, and I hope I can rise to all of the accolades you gave me. So thank you. Again, Rebecca Kurtz with Ellers, and today we're going to, as you know, talk about tax increment financing and then a little bit on development agreements. I will tell you that Ellers does an annual seminar in February that has a track on tax increment financing. And if you want to really get into this, we can talk for hours on it. And so today is really a high level overview for those that may not be real familiar with tax increment. Hopefully you can at least walk away with an understanding of what it is, high level of how it works, and how it may be able to help you in your community. And as Jaquel said, there'll be time for questions at the end, but I'm also happy to have any discussions offline or at a future date. My contact information's there if you want to connect and ask more specific questions. So with that, we will get started here. All right, I am assuming you are all seeing my introduction slide. I got that. Okay, perfect. So again, we're going to touch on tax increment financing basics today. Taking a step back though, before we even talk about what TIF is, just a reminder, especially if you are brand new in economic development, why would communities even consider providing assistance to a project? And in general, it's part of your overall economic development strategy for your community. That may include creating new jobs in your community, doing some redevelopment or cleaning up polluted sites for new development opportunities. Constructing affordable housing is a goal that we are seeing a lot of communities struggle with right now, just because of the high cost of housing, and making sure that we do have safe housing that is affordable for our communities. Increasing your tax base and growing the community may be another part of your overall goal. And ultimately, it really comes to changing community conditions. So looking at that vision of where you want your community to be, or what do you want your community to be as you look toward the future, and what might be needed, whether it is that redevelopment, the new jobs, the increased tax base, to get your community to that vision that you have, or to achieve the vision you have for your community. There we go. So again, as we look at ultimately, why do we provide assistance though to achieve those goals? Most of the time, it comes down to helping find or fill a financing gap. So you have these goals for your communities that you want to accomplish, but as we all know, it costs money, and you work with a developer, but there may not be sufficient funding to achieve the goal or achieve it to the level that you would like in your community. And so there's that financing gap that needs to be filled. If you are familiar with tax increment, you're going to hear, or you have heard the term but for. And so the but for test that is connected with tax increment is the test connected to identifying and filling that financing gap, or using tax increment to encourage development that normally would not occur but for this type of public assistance. Today, focusing on tax increment, there may be other assistance that you consider, whether it be tax abatement, maybe you have loan programs in your community, or whatever those other resources may be. But this project would not go forward but for some type of additional assistance and financing that is needed to make the project cash flow. So why may there be a financing gap? You know, at a very basic level, it's those financial barriers that present that private market or the developers that are out there from completing development in according to, again, what kind of vision and goals the community has. So again, going back to some of those goals with contaminated land or blighted buildings, it's always more expensive to redevelop a site when you need to add the demolition costs, maybe do site cleanup because of pollution, versus developing on a site that is bare land with no structures or none of the contamination issues. It may be that financing gap may be caused from high development fees in a community. You know, different communities are at different points of maturity or expanding, and so those development fees are based on, again, where the community's at and what your goals are, but sometimes those fees get high and cause some challenges to getting that new development or redevelopment completed. Something we're seeing a lot of right now is rents are too low. So for example, with the housing market, it is, as we all know, very expensive to develop housing right now, maybe looking especially at multifamily housing. That cost to develop a unit of housing doesn't always match up if the city has a goal of providing affordable or workforce housing. So there becomes that gap or financing gap in what is needed to make a project cash flow for the developer, but what your residents can afford to pay for rent. And so how do we bridge that financing gap to get that housing, but still be able to have residents afford to live in that new development? Some of the other items for causing financing gap are infrastructure costs being high. I think just with costs being high right now with what we're seeing, it's across the board on everything. I mean, when we're working on projects, we know it's the infrastructure, it's the building materials for housing. We're in that period of time that we're dealing with new challenges we didn't deal with even 3 to 5 years ago. So another reason there may be a financing gap is that there are cheaper alternatives elsewhere. Again, looking at either a redevelopment scenario where you could look at a site, or the developer could look at a site that is bare land and build the building there, or they could do this infill site that may be a goal of the community to clean up blighted buildings, clean up the pollution, but that is going to be a lot more expensive than going just down the road to that bare land, or going 5 miles down the road to another community that may have lower development fees, lower land costs. They may have the infrastructure already in. So just comparing what other options are out there for the development. And then finally, the city vision may be incompatible with the market. And this can be kind of that catch-all for all kinds of reasons why there could be a financing gap. It could be any of those items above. It may be that you have development standards through your planning and zoning that you need to have certain materials on the outside of your buildings that are going to be more expensive than being able to just put up concrete tip-up panels or whatever the case is. So it's, again, making sure that your vision is being met, but sometimes because of what the vision and goals are for the community, it is possibly adding some costs for the development. There's a couple different ways that the finance gap can be looked at. And one is looking at that difference between sources and uses. So in this simple graphic, it's again looking at those total development costs and trying to find out what we need to balance that so the sources coming forward balance with the uses. In an example like this, it may be for like an industrial type development where you're adding the development fees, the land, the expansion of infrastructure to a new industrial park, and the developer is looking at what they need for their debt, the equity that they're going to bring to the project, the cash, and even with that, we're still not getting the project to cash flow and balance. The other type of gap may be more related to ongoing operations, and an example of this would be like in a multifamily or apartment project where the goal may be to provide new housing, have an affordable component, because some of those rents may need to be below the market in order to keep them affordable to some of the residents. There may be that imbalance between what those rent revenues are going to be over the term compared to what those operating expenses and the debt service is. And so you may look at using tax increment or other financing tools to help get those in balance so this project can get through the lease up period, the initial rental period, and help support it during those first few years so it does cash flow and provide the return that is needed to encourage the developer to move forward with the project. So as we talk about these different financing gaps or what may be causing the gap, as I mentioned, TIF is one of the common tools in Minnesota to help fill the gap. Unfortunately, as you compare to some of our other neighboring states, Minnesota doesn't have as many tools in our toolbox to help with encouraging development or filling that financing gap. So TIF does become one of the very common ones. Tax abatement is another very common one that is in some ways similar to TIF. It has some pros and cons, but it is a lot more flexible. So when you look at this chart, really what we're going to discuss next is, or later on in the discussion, is that the type of goal you have is going to be a driver for the type of assistance or the type of TIF district that you may choose to use for your project. And I'll walk through that in a little more detail, but as just a reference point or as a summary, I wanted to let you know that, again, those goals being redevelopment, where you're getting rid of those substandard buildings. Affordable housing is another goal where tax increment can play a strong role. Job and tax base creation, a lot of times that is tied with like warehouse, manufacturing, industrial type development. And then you can see that if your goals do relate to like business retention or creating new public amenities in your community, tax increment is not going to be a tool that you can use for assisting those projects, but tax abatement could be something that could help fill that gap. So jumping in to tax increment, what is tax increment financing? A simple working definition of TIF is really the ability to capture and use most of the increase in local property tax revenues from new development within a specific geographic area, so specific parcels for a specific period of time. And from a city perspective, one of the benefits, I would argue, of tax increment is that while you notice the county and the school district that the TIF district is being proposed, ultimately it is the vote by the city council that will be able to capture the city, county, and school district taxes through the tax increment financing district. All of this is ultimately governed by Minnesota statutes, chapter 469. Over the years, and as Jaquel mentioned in the introduction, I'm going to have been at Ellers 22 years here, coming up in May. And over the years, we've seen a lot of changes. There's always a little bit of cleanup with it, but I also have seen it become more complicated and more regulated. So it's quite an extensive statute. If you want some light reading, I did cite the governing rules for TIF there. So taking that definition and looking at it visually, again, with TIF in this graph, we're representing that property as it stands today by that blue baseline property value. All property today outside of a TIF district has that value, with the taxes going to the city, the county, and the school district. When a TIF district is established, what it does is continue to let that value identified in blue continue to go to the city, the county, and the school district. So they continue to receive the taxes they receive today. The purple represents that increased development, whether it's through phasing or through new development, but then maybe going up over time due to phasing or inflationary increases, and how how the project's going to increase in value over time. But the area identified in purple represents that new development, or what we will refer to as the TIF. That is the amount that can be captured and then used to assist projects and help fill some of those financing gaps that we discussed. But again, the property taxes still will go as they are today to the city, county, and school district throughout the term of the TIF district. You can see then the purple represents that value after the TIF is paid off, or the district is what we call decertified. And at that point, then 100% of that value from not only the base, but also that new development is put on the tax roll at full value, and the city, county, and school district all start to receive the benefit of that new development. So a couple important points to remember with TIF, and that are sometimes misnomers by the public, is that the property through the term of the TIF district is going to pay taxes at the full assessed value. So it will go from taxes today, it will pay increased taxes when the property is fully developed. And it's going to be a delay to when the county and the school district will receive their benefit, and the city their benefit from that tax increment district. It's not ever a omission of taxes or a reduction in paying taxes. They will need to be paid in full during the term of the TIF district in order for the TIF district to work successfully. So for those of you who like numbers and want to look at it visually, or if you do work with tax increment and see the cash flow, I'm going to take a couple minutes and just walk through the numbers. I'm not expecting anybody to be able to walk away and know the calculation and do this themselves, but I know for some different learning styles it can be helpful. So again, as I mentioned in that graphic previously, that blue line across the bottom represents the value as it is today. That's also referred to as the base value. And in our example, we're going to have a tax capacity of that of 7,838. And I will say this ties with a project that was done a couple years ago, an industrial project in the Maple Grove area. So during that term of the TIF district, the taxes from this tax capacity continue to go to city, county, and school district. When we go forward and add our new industrial building on this, we see that tax capacity increase from about 7,800 to about 90,000. So the new value and taxes are going to be paid based on that tax capacity of roughly 90,000. When we look at the numbers then for this, we see that new value or new tax capacity of 90,000. To get to the TIF, we subtract out that original as it was prior to the development, because again, that is already going to be paid out to the city, county, and school. And so we see that increase in tax capacity of roughly 82,500. To get to the tax increment number or the annual TIF, that capacity or increase of about 82,500 is multiplied by the city, county, and school, the total tax rate, to get to that annual tax increment number of roughly $126,500. However, again, it's important for the developer and everyone to remember that that is not going to be the tax payment they make. In this chart here, again, you can see those calculations going through that as you break down the taxes, the developer or the property owner will pay. those total taxes will be closer to 183,800. And in order for the TIF to, in this case, successfully work, they will need to pay all of the taxes based on that assessed market value for the completed project with that new building. So where does that difference between that 183,800 that they're paying in taxes versus that 126,500 that is actually the TIF, where does that go? In the case of commercial properties, the state does retain part of the revenue through the state commercial industrial tax that cannot be captured through tax increment in any scenario. So that will come out. If you are in the metro area, there may be the fiscal disparities adjustment that goes into the metro pool that cannot be captured and would come out. Market value taxes also cannot be captured by TIF. And when we talk about market value taxes, many times those are tied to school referendums. And so if the school does have a referendum that's been approved based on market value, those taxes that are paid for that school project cannot be touched through tax increment. So that is one sometimes misnomer, is that tax increment will dramatically hurt the school and we're not going to get our funding for our school project. And for the most part, if they are operating or referendums for the school that are on market value taxes, TIF can't even touch it. And generally, we don't see a lot of impact to school funding regardless with tax increment. And I will say I am not an expert in school funding, but we do have a team that helps get me through when we have those questions. We have a team that works with school financing. And the formula for school funding is extremely complicated, but it is not dependent solely on property taxes. So that's where there's a little bit of a disconnect in perception sometimes, that TIF revenue or the schools having a TIF district in place is not going to cause dramatic impacts on the funding that the schools get, because their funding isn't tied to the property taxes like cities. And then the final number that we're taking out is the taxes from that base value. So again, city, county, and schools still receiving their proportionate share of the 12,000 in taxes. So as we look at that total property taxes being paid of 187, that gets us to the TIF amount based on that new development of taxes equal to about 126,500. So again, taking this same example and moving it forward, you can see, and this is an example of those that may work with Ellers and use TIF, what our cash flows look like. We take that property tax capacity from the new development, again, full value from the assessor, subtract out what was there prior to development or that base value. It ties across, you can see then we have the captured times that tax rate. And again, getting to that number of about 126,500 in TIF. Because taxes are paid semi-annually, we typically look at semi-annual payments when we're structuring TIF, because since taxes come in semi-annually, communities can make semi-annual payments on any TIF obligation. So it's divided in half. From there, with tax increment, the state auditor who oversees TIF districts and TIF in our state does get a portion of it, again, not negotiable. So they get their 0.36%. With this, then cities have the ability to retain up to 10% for administrative purposes. because again, you're entering into, when you set up that TIF district, there's going to be long-term maintenance of this for the term of the TIF district. There are annual reports that need to be filed with the state auditor's office. There are going to there'll be the semi-annual payments, whether they are related to repaying city obligations or paying a third party. And then there are just going to be questions, upkeep, and other things that come up during that term, whatever it be for the TIF district. So as a community, you can retain that 10% for assisting with those consulting fees, assisting with your staff time, and those other expenses that are related. With that, then, assuming you retain that full 10%, it equates to about $56,750 in TIF that would be available semi-annually to assist with your project. As we look at what does that really mean though for the project, again, because it's going to come in over time. In this example, we'll assume that we go the full 9 years for an economic development district. So you can see with semi-annual revenue streams of roughly $56,750 over the term, it gets to about $1,021,000 in TIF. Many times, and we'll talk about financing just very, very high level, but many times that is then given to a third party or turned into financing to help fill that gap. And there is a note issued, and many times that note bears an interest component. So you can think of it similar to like a mortgage for a home. Over time, over these 9 years, you're going to pay over $1,021,000. But with that revenue stream, you could get principal of about $834,000, pay a 4% interest rate over that 9-year time. And with principal and interest, you would be paying total debt service of roughly $1,021,000. So as we think about how does that turn into, how do you take that revenue stream and that $1 million or that roughly 800,000 in principal and get it into something that is a useful form to fill that financing gap that we talked about at the beginning? There are 3 common ways, I'll say. And I'm going to start with talking about a pay-as-you-go note, because that is what we would say is probably it's the most common and would recommend as a consultant to the city as the first step when you're starting to negotiate a deal. With a pay-as-you-go note, the city would then enter into their agreement and give the developer a note for that roughly $830,000 and say, we will give you payments in principal of $830,000 with that 4% interest rate over 9 years. If you then upfront those costs, get your project done, and we'll reimburse with those annual payments up to that $800,000 amount. The reason that we typically start with recommending issuance of a pay-as-you-go note from a city perspective is that it is the least risk to the city. With a pay-as-you-go note, the developer is going to take the risk of getting the project financed. So they will work with their lender, get the funding for the project. The TIF for this pay-as-you-go note may go to help pay debt service with their financing, but they're going to be responsible to get the financing. They're going to be responsible to get the project built, and they're going to be responsible to get the project built to the, so it assesses at a value that we anticipate when we are starting the project. It puts all of that risk in the event that the worst case scenario happens and the project doesn't come in assessed at the value anticipated. Maybe the developer doesn't actually build the project in a really worst case scenario. Maybe the legislature changes some rules with TIF that we don't foresee happening. Anything that may go wrong to impact that revenue stream of TIF becomes a risk for the developer under the pay-as-you-go note scenario. As you look at the other side, over here on the far extreme is issuance of a GO bond or a general obligation bond, which is a scenario that puts all of that risk on the city if the city issues general obligation bonds. In that scenario, the city would say, you know what, we will go out to the market. We're going to issue general obligation bonds. We're going to pledge the TIF and we hope and think it's going to be sufficient revenue to pay the debt service on the bonds. But with this general obligation pledge, in the event that the project isn't valued as high, the project isn't built, worst case scenario comes, if the city has issued general obligation bonds, they are still going to be responsible for making sure that debt service payment is made. And in the event that the TIF revenue stream is not there or not sufficient, the city has made a promise that they will levy taxes to make sure the bonds are paid. There absolutely have been a few times when that is something that, you know, the city says we are addressing a need that is a priority. We're willing to take that risk. But many times we don't see cities immediately jump up to want to put that risk on their community. The middle scenario here of a revenue bond is something that I would say 10, 15 years ago, we maybe saw more frequently. We don't see it very often anymore, but that is where the developer, we move forward with the project. The developer then pledges the TIF to a third party. We would call it a sophisticated lender. And it's going to be like a US Bank or a Doherty Colliers, somebody who has a very good understanding of TIF, the market, and risks. And the developer will go to that third party and say, we'll give you the TIF from this project. We would like you to give us cash. And as using that previous example of 830, many times because of the risk associated with this, that third party is not going to give that full 830. They're going to reduce it, have a discount on that. But that third party will come to an agreement with the developer and say, we'll take the TIF note. We're going to take the risk, and hopefully your TIF is going to be sufficient to pay off this obligation. It is an agreement between the developer and a third party. So while this is happening and the city is going to have a relationship with them because it's all part of that final team, in this case of a revenue bond, to the extent that the TIF is not sufficient to pay the debt service, the city is not responsible to make any shortfall payments. Again, just because of a lot of these were outstanding in like 2008, early 2000s, they did not do well. They were not paid in full. We are not seeing this happen frequently anymore, maybe on very, very large redevelopment projects, but it's not very common. So I would really, again, focus on the pay-as-you-go note as the type of financing that we see most frequently. As we talk about the different types of assistance, then looking at TIF, again, just there are three main purposes why we see tax increment being used and different goals for communities. The first one, looking at redevelopment or what may be a renovation or renewal TIF district. Under both of these, that goal is redevelopment. You need to have blighted buildings. You need to make sure that the site has improvements on it. But after that qualification is met, you could put anything on the site. You can do, the Twin Cities Outlet Mall was on a redevelopment site. There's housing in Robbinsdale with the Parker Station Flats that was on a redevelopment site. There's this project in Worthington where they had a historic hotel that they wanted to rehab. In this case, they didn't actually do demolition of the building, but they were able to use a redevelopment TIF district to rehab an old vacant blighted hotel and turn it into housing for the community. In the case of housing TIF districts, again, that goal is going to be creating affordable housing for the community, whether it be rental housing or owner occupied housing. And there are going to be some requirements with having at least a portion of the units or a portion of the housing affordable to people that meet certain income requirements. So in the case of the senior housing project in Grand Rapids or a mixed income project in the city of Richfield, in these two projects, 50% of, let me back up here. There are two requirements that need to be made, or two options for rental housing and meeting income limits. One is 40% of the units can be available to people at or below 60% of area median income, or 20% of the units can be available to people at or below 50% of area median income. So with that, it's going to be a decision between the developer and the community on what standard you apply, whether it is 40% of the units at 60% of area median income or 20% of the units at 50%. But that can provide that option for some affordability with housing projects, and then the balance of those could be at market or whatever works per the market study and demands in the community. The other option is, for an example, this project in Richfield, which is owner occupied townhomes. If you are doing for sale housing, 95% of the units, so basically the entire development, maybe less one or two homes, need to be available for people that meet either 100 to 115% of the area median income. And again, that 100 to 115% range is based on the number of people in the household. If it's a single person, 100%. If it's a family of four, you could go up to 115%. When we are looking at economic development districts, typically we are looking at a greenfield site. One of the requirements for an economic development district is that it has to be used for manufacturing, warehouse, distribution, or telemarketing. So these are really the option for developing industrial parks or business parks in a community. The one exception to that is a couple of years ago, the legislature made a change. So an economic development district can be used to create workforce housing. What that means is it has to be outside the 7-county metro. Workforce housing is market rate housing, so there are not income limits on it. It's market rate housing, but in order to use this tool, the community does have to be able to prove there is a rental vacancy that is 3% or lower in the community. And there needs to be a letter from an employer saying, we need housing in our community, so I, as an employer, can hire employees and meet my workforce demands. We're not seeing a lot of these, but it is a tool if you're outside the 7-county metro area. The process for doing a TIF district at a very, very high level really starts even before you have that project in place. And again, as we mentioned, right away, knowing and talking about, what is your vision, and having a policy in place that says, here's our vision, here's why we may want to use TIF or other tools to assist projects to move forward. Here's the types of projects we're willing to assist. After that is in place, then you have that application or a process where the developer comes forward. And from that standpoint, once you get that project in hand, many things can happen at the same point or along the same time. It's that review of what is that gap for the project. It's starting to negotiate the terms of a deal. It's getting that agreement in place, and then establishing that tax increment district so that financing tool is in place when the project is completed. Looking specifically at the TIF process, then it starts with gathering that information. I showed you a cash flow. You need to figure out what is the project going to be, get some basic information on values, tax rates, understand what kind of gap may be out there for the project if assistance is needed. A TIF process usually takes roughly 60 to 90 days. During that process, there are resolutions that need to be drafted. If you have, you may need the Planning Commission to review it. You'll want your EDA to review it if you have an EDA. There are notices to the county and school district, even though they don't get to vote on the TIF. There are notices that they are required to receive so they can review it and comment. Then it ends with having a public hearing. So you have a public hearing notice, minimum 10-day publication, with the council holding a public hearing and deciding whether or not they want to establish that TIF district and direct that increase in tax revenue to assist with the project. So from that standpoint, after you have your TIF district established or are on track to establish it, the second part of it is putting that deal together in the actual contract, because establishing the TIF district puts the tool in place, but it does not create that obligation to pay out the TIF. And so it starts that negotiation between the community and the developer on what is this deal and that final contract going to look like. And there's several key factors that you as a community are going to want to think about. What are, again, back to those goals, that vision you have for the community, and how does this proposed project fit within those goals and what you are willing to do. There's always going to be those restrictions and the legal requirements, limitations of what can be done, whether it is from planning perspectives or from the statutory TIF requirements on how the TIF can be used to assist the project. As you put together your negotiation team, one of the first steps is identifying who is going to be part of your community team to negotiate. I would say it makes sense to have your staff, your consultants. Sometimes city councils or EDAs want to get involved. And my advice to you on that is having a process to keep your council or board informed is extremely important. But in my experience, when you start getting the council or board involved in the negotiations, it becomes more complicated. And so really having that understanding that you as a staff are the point person and going to be that key part of the team, you all make sure that you keep the decision makers informed, but not necessarily having them sit at the table during that negotiation process. Other items that you're going to want to consider as you're starting that negotiation are those private market demands. So looking at, the feasibility of the project, understanding what kind of return the developer is going to need to make this project move forward and be successful. understanding, what kind of limitations there may be to getting access to capital. And again, that's a role that consultants may be able to play and assist you with at the community level. And then ultimately understanding and having that comfort level of knowing when is too much and when you may need to walk away. So you may be comfortable providing TIF, but it's that question, and this is really going to be based on your individual community. If you give TIF, if you give away the land and you reduce fees, at what point you always are going to have the right, and as hard as it may be to get to that point, to say, you know what, we just can't do this project. And knowing and being comfortable that if it gets to be a level that is not going to work for your community, you absolutely have that right to walk away. So this project needs to work for both parties. As you look at that development agreement, again, that's going to be that final contract that is going to memorialize the goals of your partnership. It's going to identify what the developer needs to do in order to receive any type of assistance, and the conditions for that public assistance. So, what is the maximum amount? What is that maximum term that you're going to be willing to pay out over? If you're going to have an interest component, what is that interest rate going to be? What needs to be done in order to receive those payments? What kind of deadlines need to be met? If there's phasing, when does phase 1 start? When should it be substantially complete? What's the latest date that phase 2 can start? And when does that need to be substantially complete? If you have a project that is a housing project with income limits, your agreement is going to lay out what those income restrictions are, tying with the TIF statute, and what kind of reporting the developer is going to be responsible to provide on an annual basis prior to getting their TIF payment. If it is an economic development project, there are likely going to be job and wage goals or business subsidy requirements. The development agreement is going to be that document that's going to outline those minimum jobs that need to be created, what that minimum wage is, and the ramifications if those requirements are not going to be met. And then finally, if there are any provisions that you agree to go back and review the project and the financing when it's completed, or a look back, that's going to be outlined in the agreement, along with any default provisions. We always go into these with that understanding and hope of this is going to work out well for everybody and have not have any hiccups, but things happen. And so in that worst case scenario, the agreement will outline what happens, how do you remedy this, and what are the next steps if we have to deal with the worst case scenario, which again, we always hope we don't have to. We hope everybody's done their due diligence, so that's just more of a safety net. With that, oh, I'm sorry, I will just a little bit more. I think I've covered a lot of this, but on, again, those pay-as-you-go terms. So if you are doing that pay-as-you-go in the development agreement, again, identifying that documentation for those qualifying activities, outlining those terms of how that note to the developer is going to be issued, the default provisions, and as part of the default provisions, if you don't pay out all of the TIF, how does that get remedied, or what would be the cases where you may not pay out all of the TIF? But again, that development agreement outlining everything that's needed. I think as a final point related to the development agreement, I would encourage you to, as you're putting together your team, think about using an attorney that is specializing in TIF to help do some of those agreements. I know city attorneys are involved in a lot of projects, and from most aspects of the development, can bring a lot of knowledge and resource. But with TIF, I do think that sometimes having an attorney who understands TIF and does hundreds of these a year does help that process go a little bit more efficiently and maybe a little more cost effective for your community. And again, I will remind you that firms like Ellers or Baker Tilly, Northland help do the TIF, but we are not the attorneys that are drafting this. So there are firms like Taft, Dorsey, Kennedy and Graven that really do have some expertise that can benefit with some of those specific legal agreements related to the TIF. With that, we have a few minutes, and I am happy to, again, my contact information was in the handout too. And I'm happy to take any questions that may be out there.
Thanks
I'll
for,
ask a question.
oh yeah, go ahead, August.
Sorry, I'll just jump right in. So I'm looking at slide 15, it's cash flows, how it ties out, in case people are following along. When you get down below the semi-annual net tax increment to the 1,000,021, would you
Yes.
consider that the actual value of the note? Or how do you get to, if you're talking about it in, conversationally, and you say we've got a TIF note of X value, is that what you would reference?
Great question. And this is probably one of the more complicated things to try and understand this idea of present value with TIF. We would say the value of the note is that 834,000.
Okay.
And again, we would look at that if from maybe a more practical example, look at that as a mortgage payment. So, you buy a house or you get a mortgage for 834,000. That's the value of your loan. And that 1,021,000, that revenue stream that's going to come in over time is going to be the revenue to pay off principal and interest on the note of 834,000. So with that, maybe putting a little finer point on it, the city enters in, you have your development agreement. When you have the project completed, the city will give the developer a pay-as-you-go note for the amount of 834,000. As taxes come in semi-annually, the developer or the city will make a payment to the developer of $56,750 in the example on slide 15. That payment of $56,750 is then going toward principal and interest in our example of 4% to pay off an obligation of $834,000.
Okay.
And so in theory, over that 9 years, you would be paying $834,000 in principal and roughly $200,000 in interest on that note.
Okay. Understood. Thanks.
Absolutely.
And I know we're coming up on time here, but just a quick question, Rebecca. I know that in certain districts, cities have the opportunity to include public infrastructure projects or different things like that. How can TIF be leveraged to fund different public investments that cities may have to make to upfront some of that cost?
Great question. So TIF does have some restrictions on how it can be used, and generally we say at ground level and below. And so if you are looking at a project that has a large public infrastructure component, you could use TIF to help get that public infrastructure in place. In that case, there may be many ways that you could finance it. You could have the developer put in that infrastructure, use a pay-as-you-go note to reimburse the developer for it. That may be a case where the city looks at issuing bonds and using the using the TIF to help pay that debt service, because it is a city infrastructure or city project, and the TIF can write down the tax levy or the assessments or whatever funding source the city might traditionally use to get that infrastructure into that new development.
Great, thank you.
We are right at time. Is there any outstanding questions that anybody wants to really ask?
And as I mentioned, my contact information's there. I'd love to connect with any and all of you. Give me a call or email, whatever's easiest for you. And I know I'm a consultant, but we don't charge just for these calls. So, happy to provide any information or answer additional questions, be a resource if there's anything I can do for you, whether it's hypothetically or for real projects. I know that in my 22 years, EDAM has been an organization and group that has been very helpful in helping get me to where I am, and I would like to be able to do the same for others. So,
well, Rebecca, we really appreciate you. That was a great presentation. This was recorded and will be posted on our EDAM website on the emerging professional page. So our EDAM staff will help with that if you had to jump off early. Otherwise, Rebecca, again, we appreciate your wealth of knowledge, and this was fun to have you on. We will be hosting these quarterly lunchbox series. So the next one will be about 3 months from now. We haven't set the date, but look for something in July, and we'll have a similar topic that's timing and kind of fitting to what else we learned from the conference. So we'll keep your emails posted for that event opportunity, and we'll see some of you at the next EDAM event.
thanks, everyone.